Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this edition of Newsmakers. I'm Madison, Staten. Local nonprofit Casa de Peregrinos says the rising cost of food is influencing the amount of food insecurity in our region. I visited the nonprofit to learn more about what this means for the Las Cruces community.
Child food insecurity rose approximately 4% in Doña Ana County between 2019 and 2020. But for those who serve at the Casa de Peregrinos food program in Las Cruces, food disparity in southern New Mexico is more than just one single statistic.
It's a crying shame that in a land of plenty, that people are still going hungry. These are our neighbors here in our community, and we need to reach out a hand to help them.
That's Nancy Ryan, a member of the nonprofit's grant writing team. She says annual food costs have risen significantly over the past 3 years for the organization.
We have seen the cost of what we have spent for food go from about 5 cents a pound in 2019 to about 9 cents a pound in 2020 to about 13 cents a pound in 2021. And that's a major additional cost to the organization, because what we're talking about distributing is over 5 million pounds of food per year.
Despite rising food costs, Ryan says Casa de Peregrinos is committed to keeping distribution levels the same. Currently, families are eligible for 85 pounds of food per month, translating to roughly 71 meals.
It really only fills in the edges of what a family needs. A family really cannot depend on Casa de Peregrinos to provide everything that they need.
And it's not only the cost of food that's rising. The program's client base grew by over 5,000 individuals in 2020, with approximately 35,000 unique clients. Though that number has since decreased, Ryan says the number of individuals in need of services continues to grow by an average of 1,000 each year. To be able to serve that growing need, the city of Las Cruces recently approved an allocation of $3.75 million to help fund a facilities expansion for a new warehouse space. Casa de Peregrinos Executive Director Lorenzo Alba Jr. addressed the city council when the expansion was first approved.
This isn't solely a Casa de Peregrinos project or a City of Las Cruces project. This is in fact a community project. It's going to benefit this community that so badly needs this. It's going to allow us to be innovative and allow us to share that same vision that the city is developing with doing something about what's going on with poverty in our community.
The nonprofit is also working to make plans to fill any gaps in funding resources that could occur from a decrease in pandemic aid. In her role as a grant writer, Nancy Ryan says the program saw a large influx of pandemic-related funding, but notes it's difficult to pinpoint what those numbers will look like for 2022.
It could leave holes. The foundation funding is a significant portion of it, and if it goes away, we just have to redouble our efforts to find other sources of funding.
Above all, Ryan says that the fight to end food insecurity can't be won by Casa de Peregrinos alone. Rather, it is a continuous effort that will take the entire community.
To talk more about food insecurity in our state, we're joined by Emily Wildau from the nonprofit child advocacy organization, New Mexico Voices for Children. Thanks for joining us today, Emily.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's start with the basics. How does New Mexico's food insecurity rate compare with other states nationally?
Like a lot of things, we are towards the bottom of that list. As of 2021 estimates, there's only 2 states that are doing worse in child food insecurity than New Mexico.
So what are factors unique to New Mexico that influence our state's high rate?
I would put those in a couple of categories. We have our structural issues and challenges and our economic issues. So structurally, we're the fifth largest state geographically. We have a lot of rural communities, and many of those communities have limited access to food, particularly healthy and fresh foods. Economically, we have incredibly high rates of poverty. This is tied to a variety of factors, but ultimately far too many of our families don't have the financial resources they need to provide the basics like food for their children. And this stems from regressive tax policy, low-wage jobs, a lack of access to higher education, which supports higher lifetime earnings and better job prospects, and lots of other things. It's a really complicated thing, of course, but those are kind of the two broad umbrellas that I would say influence our high rate of food insecurity.
Well, I know New Mexico Voices for Children reported the child food insecurity rate was approximately 29% in Doña Ana County in 2020. That's up 4% from 2019. So what would you attribute the rising percentage to? Would it be the pandemic?
Yes, I would absolutely say the pandemic has been a huge factor in the increase in food insecurity. At the height of the pandemic, over half of households in New Mexico had reported lost employment income. And since we were already a high poverty state, communities all over New Mexico, including Doña Ana, had not had an opportunity to save and prepare in case of an emergency, particularly one like COVID-19 that none of us really could have imagined. And we know that families haven't recovered financially. So data at this point indicates about 38% of New Mexico households with children are still struggling to have enough food for their kids to eat.
So since that report, how has that percentage changed specifically in Doña Ana County?
It's improved slightly. It's down now to 26.4%, so not significant, but the progress in the right direction is due to a lot of great work by our state and federal government to put money in the hands of our families who desperately needed it. We've got data that shows the expanded child tax credit was used by families to purchase basic needs, including food. And New Mexico increased and expanded our working families tax credit and gave emergency aid to families left out of federal economic relief, particularly immigrant communities. And both of those gave families the resources to put food on the table.
So how does Doña Ana County compare to current statewide trends?
Doña Ana is actually sitting kind of near the middle of the pack compared to other counties in the state. It's probably due in part to having more access to food assistance than some of the more rural counties, which may not have as many food pantries or grocery stores, and may have fewer opportunities for people to get high-paying jobs.
Well, in what ways does food insecurity impact children differently than adults?
That's a great question. Anybody who's not getting enough food faces significant health struggles, and that's particularly true for children. Childhood food insecurity increases the likelihood of obesity, which results in a greater likelihood of health concerns throughout their lifetimes. And kids who face food insecurity also tend to struggle in school, both academically and behaviorally. And that can hinder their ability to succeed while they're in school and after graduation.
So how has federal funding worked to alleviate some of the pandemic impacts within New Mexico?
We know that the child tax credit was used by the majority of families to cover their basic needs like purchasing food. And this is true of other economic relief money that went directly into the hands of families who spent it locally on things that they need like food. And beyond the relief payments and tax credits, federal funding to provide pandemic EBT ensured that kids who rely on school meals were still able to get those from home. Their parents had the pandemic EBT to take to the store and make sure they weren't missing those meals.
Well, how has rising food costs influenced the current situation?
Obviously, as the cost of food rises and family income levels remain the same, it becomes harder to purchase enough food. And for families who are accessing SNAP benefits, that benefit is also not increasing to match the rising costs. And we know that families were struggling before, so it's definitely only exacerbating the existing issue.
Can you explain to me the impact that New Mexico food deserts are currently having on the situation as well?
Yes, so I mentioned we're a really large geographic state with a lot of rural communities, and we have, a low level of transportation infrastructure for families that don't have a car or can't afford to make a long trip to a grocery store. And so another term that I particularly like for food desert, which is a USDA designation, is food apartheid, because it's part of a larger structural issue of food access. So of course, the more rural a community, the less access there may be to food sources. But people living in low-income neighborhoods, which in New Mexico is 20% of children live in high poverty areas, there's fewer grocery stores nearby. And these neighborhoods tend to have more fast food restaurants, convenience stores with small grocery selections instead of full-service grocery stores with a lot of fruits and vegetables. And the reason I say food apartheid instead of food desert is because it's part of a built environment and is connected to structural racism. So 20% of all New Mexico children live in high poverty areas, but only 8% of white children do. And that's compared to 20% of Hispanic kids, 20% of Black kids, and 44% of Native American kids. So these communities are in poverty because of historical policy choices that have never been alleviated. And as a result, basic amenities like grocery stores and healthcare are often not available. So you have structural racism leading to food apartheid and impacting food insecurity, particularly along these racial lines.
And what role does education play in this as well?
Nutrition is a component of food insecurity. So, if you're food insecure, you're more likely to be obese or diabetic. And so ensuring kids are educated when it comes to what is good for them and connecting them in New Mexico specifically to our rich land traditions and our agricultural communities through education can really help them understand the larger food system, where their food comes from, the disparities in access, and the unhealthy nature of cheap and processed foods. And this is beneficial, but our communities and children should also be empowered to actively participate in the policy process. It's important to educate our families in this process so they can advocate for higher wages and improved environments that enable them to make the healthy decisions they typically want to make and to be able to buy enough food to prevent food insecurity.
Well, in recent years, what are some of the positive strides our state has made concerning this issue?
I am so glad you've asked this question. This is something I'm really, really excited about. So this legislative session, for the first time, New Mexico put a significant amount of funding into a coordinated effort to address food systems and hunger in our state. The legislature allocated $24 million to Food, Farm, and Hunger Initiative that will support a variety of programs across several state agencies. And this is by far the most money we've ever put into ending hunger for New Mexicans. And it's also part of a longer term plan. The governor's office has been working with a broad coalition of community members and advocates to develop a 5-year plan for food, farm, and hunger. And that'll lay out key strategies to help us move the needle on food insecurity. So it's still being developed, but it's definitely an exciting step on the issue, and I'd encourage everyone to watch for that in the coming months.
Well, can you share some other examples of personal success that you've witnessed?
Yeah, I think, we saw all of our providers of emergency food assistance really step up during the pandemic and do, just really amazing things to make sure that people who were experiencing food insecurity for the first time had access to food. Then the Food, Farm, and Hunger Initiative and this 5-year plan is really probably the most exciting example of success that I have seen since I've been working on this issue. And getting a group of people together that includes advocates and farmers and policymakers to really talk about what our food system looks like, what it looks like to make that system more just, what it looks like to make sure we're providing food for our own communities and relying on our traditions and our agricultural producers is just very, very exciting to see. And it's exciting to see people finding consensus and moving forward on things that research research is indicating will be helpful in addressing food insecurity.
Well, we've spoke about some of the positives. What more should state lawmakers be doing to help the situation?
Yes, I really have to applaud them for the great work they did this session to address food insecurity. And moving forward, there's a couple of things I hope they'll do. I hope that they'll provide some amount of recurring funding to support our food banks, particularly in purchasing food for emergency assistance. Most of us feel like and really want the pandemic to be drawing to a close, but many New Mexicans are still dealing with the economic fallout. And leaders at our food banks have said they don't expect the increased need they've seen to end anytime soon. And the other thing I'd ask is that our lawmakers remain persistent in funding the Food, Farm, and Hunger Initiative. We can't make transformational progress on food insecurity if we don't continue to fund the programs that ensure families and communities can access food. We also have to continue working on making sure we have those revenues available to support those programs. And that involves getting us less reliant on the boom and bust oil and gas cycle.
Absolutely. So what are some of the current programs available for those experiencing food insecurity?
The best place I would say you can start is getting in touch with a local food pantry or calling Roadrunner Food Bank's food assistance line to find one if you don't know one in your area. They can also help people enroll in SNAP benefits, and often the people working at food pantries know of other services that folks experiencing food insecurity tend to need. So that's a place I would start. Another thing is if the state has provided a lot of economic relief throughout the pandemic, and if anyone thinks they might be eligible for that relief, particularly immigrant families that were left out of federal stimulus programs, keep an eye on the New Mexico Human Services Department website. There should be a new round of economic relief payments coming up soon, and families can apply for that through that website.
So what is your message to those that are currently experiencing food insecurity?
Yeah, my message is, that there's a lot of places you can look for help, and everybody needs help at some point. And so it's really great to live in a state where there's so many people that care about providing food to you. So I would say that seek those out and get involved in the policy process to help address the root causes of food insecurity.
So when it comes to finding permanent solutions, what are the biggest barriers that you think we face as a state?
The biggest challenge, and I think this is true for most of our issues, is funding. New Mexico's got so many incredibly smart and compassionate people who care about solving food insecurity, and this is still the first time we've been able to put forward a cohesive plan that includes funding with the Food, Farm, and Hunger Initiative. So we need to focus on diversifying our state revenue so we can continue providing that funding when oil and gas inevitably hits another decline. And to diversify our state's revenue, we need to look at our tax policy. It's important to make sure that the wealthiest people and corporations in New Mexico are paying their fair share of taxes. Right now, our system is regressive, which means that the hardworking people in New Mexico pay more in taxes as a share of their income than those who can actually afford to pay. And so if we can introduce a more equitable tax system, we can keep funding programs like the Food, Farm, and Hunger Initiative that are critical to addressing food insecurity in New Mexico.
Can you explain to me a little bit about the partnerships and their importance in fighting food insecurity in New Mexico?
Yes, the partnerships are really key because food insecurity is such a complicated issue. So you have groups like New Mexico Voices that focus heavily on the tax policy and making the system more fair for everyone involved. You have the farmers who are working on sustainable practices and increasing production and being able to provide food for our own communities. And you have people experiencing food insecurity who are going to food banks to get emergency assistance. You have programs like SNAP. So there's a lot of complicated interplaying things involved in food insecurity. So it's really, really critical that we all continue coming to the table and working together so we can find solutions that actually will serve our communities and address these issues.
Well, speaking of solutions, what are some of the long-term solutions that you've identified that you still think need to be explored?
I'm truly optimistic and excited about the long-term plan that we've been working on in coalition with a variety of partners. It's key for our solutions to include the full food system. So we don't want to just put a Band-Aid on it by making sure people can access food assistance. We want to make sure we're looking at the whole process from farm to table. And the plan that's being developed right now really considers that big picture. And we have a lot of agricultural communities in New Mexico and traditional wisdom around food production, and including local growers in the solution to ensure everyone has enough healthy food to eat, I think really has the potential to make a radical difference, along with many other strategies developed by communities in partnership with the governor's office.
Well, your organization recently released the New Mexico Kids Count data book. What were some of the key findings from that report that currently are influencing food insecurity?
Yes, so I mentioned, the rate of kids living in high poverty areas, which certainly influences food insecurity. And that's 20% of children in New Mexico in 2019. And the rate of children living in high poverty areas in Doña Ana County is actually much higher at 45%. We've also got around a quarter of our kids living in poverty. And in 2020, for a family of 3, this would mean they have an income of $21,720. And again, in Doña Ana County, the rate was 38%. We also see children living in families whose parents don't have secure employment. So that's about 30% of our kids. And this means that their parents don't have full-time year-round work. They may be working part-time or seasonally. They may be home caring for a family member, or they may be attending school themselves. They may be unemployed as well. So there's a variety of reasons that parents don't have secure employment, but that's another factor, because if they're working part-time, they're likely in a low-wage job. They're likely not able to afford the food that they really need for their families. And then I'd mentioned pandemic data that we've seen. A quarter of households with children are still reporting that they lost employment income in the last 4 weeks. And 38% of households with children are still reporting that kids in the home are not eating enough because food is unaffordable. I would say that the silver lining to all of this is that over the last decade, we've seen improvement in these categories. It's been incremental and not transformational. But I do want to be sure to mention that even though we remain near the bottom in the national rankings, we're really making progress.
Well, how do you think that people can help with this issue?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that people can help with this issue by educating themselves and being aware of the problem. And they can volunteer to help with food insecurity. They can volunteer at food banks. They can get involved in the policy process, and they can join the campaign to diversify our revenue so we have funding for these programs. There's really a lot of different avenues people can take, and I think if there's any piece that really stands out, there's someone they can find to get involved in the issue.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. In what ways do you predict yourself that the state of food insecurity in New Mexico will change over the next decade?
I'm an optimist about this issue. I think that even though it unfortunately took a pandemic, we've seen a lot of really significant wins and progress moving forward to address food insecurity. I don't know if New Mexico would have put the level of funding they did into the budget for food insecurity if not for the seriousness of the hardships families are still facing as a result of COVID-19. But I am hopeful that this is the beginning of a new pattern for us. And in the next decade, if we keep moving in the direction we're moving, if we push forward with things like the Food, Farm, and Hunger Initiative and keep working to make our tax system more equitable and therefore food more affordable for working families, I think we'll see our rates of food insecurity decrease at a level we haven't seen. I think it just takes that stick-with-itness of continuing forward with things that are having an impact for our families and communities.
Well, in your mind, what are the key takeaways for our audience on this topic today?
I think the key takeaway is that food insecurity is really a symptom of greater economic injustice. When it takes a couple of jobs and SNAP benefits and the family still struggles to have enough food to eat throughout the month, you've got to consider what's driving that. People need jobs that pay a living wage, and they need a fair tax system that funds programs that make a difference for working families, so they can really thrive and leave the worries of where their next meal is going to come from behind them. So that's the key takeaway for me, that there is a big picture to look at when thinking about food insecurity, and that there are real policy changes that can be implemented to address that.
Well, pivoting a little bit to you, what drives you personally in your current role in this fight against food insecurity?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I have lived in New Mexico my whole life. I was born in Southeast New Mexico. I went to school in Las Cruces. I moved to Albuquerque for my job. And I just believe so much in the potential of our state. I believe that we have the best place to live and we have the best people here, and it's a matter of circumstance and policy choices that have caused so many of our problems. And so for me, I really enjoy being part of solutions that are upstream from the problem, and places where we can make real decisions with our leadership and with our communities to change daily life for kids and families. I think that that's the thing that I think about every day, and that's what gets me excited about this work, is that it's not something we just have to live with and deal with. It's something we can actually work on and solve and join together to address.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Emily. I so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Absolutely. Well, that's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Madison Staten. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.